Tonight, we're going back to a night so quiet it should have been safe. A night when a small prehistoric tribe went to sleep under the stars, surrounded by their fires, their families, their children, and never woke up again. No wars, no armies, no warning. Just silence and then extinction. Archaeologists call it one of the most haunting discoveries ever found. A valley filled with bodies frozen in sleep, tools still in their hands, pots still over the fire, the last moments of an entire community captured in ash. No one rebuilt, no one returned. It was as if they had been erased from history overnight. For thousands of years, no one even knew they existed until scientists stumbled upon the ruins and realized what had really happened. It wasn't disease. It wasn't a natural disaster. It was a coordinated ambush. Their killers came in the dark, armed with precision and silence, and wiped out every living soul before dawn. The evidence they left behind reads like the first chapter of organized human violence, a story older than writing, older than memory itself. So how do we know what happened that night? How do we reconstruct the final breaths of a people who vanished before history began? That's what this video is about. If you're watching this while you fall asleep, this one might keep you awake. Subscribe maybe, and tell me where you are and what time it is. I love seeing it, like Tokyo at midnight, London at lunch, New York half asleep. All of us connected, across thousands of miles and 100,000 years, to the night when one tribe closed their eyes and never opened them again. You know that silence that feels wrong, the kind that makes the air heavy, like the world itself is holding its breath. That was the silence before the ambush. Picture this. A small valley, tucked between two ridges that cradle the last warmth of a dying fire. The stars are sharp and clear, cutting through the darkness like pinholes in black cloth. A tribe sleeps in peace, unaware that this will be their final night on earth. Their camp smells of wood smoke and roasted roots. Children curl beside their mothers, wrapped in furs still holding the scent of the hunt. Warriors rest near the perimeter, trusting the rhythm of the crickets and the cool wind that moves through the grass. No one expects death to come when the night is calm. No one ever does. But somewhere beyond the ridge, another group is already moving. Their feet make no sound. Their bodies are painted with ash and animal fat to hide their scent. They have been watching for days, memorizing the paths, the routines, the exact moment when the last ember fades. They wait until even the dogs stop growling. The hunters in the dark know that this is the moment before dawn when humans sleep the deepest. They step forward, one by one, as if the earth itself is giving birth to shadows. Back in the camp, a single spark glows where the fire once burned. It flickers against a clay pot, a woman's hand, a half-carved tool. The world is quiet except for the breath of the living. It is a moment so ordinary it feels eternal. Then something changes. A whisper of motion, a shift in the air. The first to die does not even wake. A sharp crack, soft enough to be mistaken for a breaking stick, and everything begins. But before we go further, you have to understand what is about to vanish. This tribe was not nameless. They had stories, laughter, arguments, dreams. They had survived winters and droughts. They had built shelters that faced the rising sun because they believed light gave protection. They had children who played with bones carved into small animals. They were not primitive. They were human, as real as you and me, just separated by time. But history has no memory for those who left no witnesses. By morning, the valley would be silent. The smoke would rise into the cold air, carrying with it the last trace of people who thought tomorrow was guaranteed. Archaeologists would find the remains thousands of years later, trying to read the story written in ash and bone. But tonight, there are no scientists, no cameras, no one to warn them. Only the moon, a thin white eye watching from above, reflecting the glint of a blade as it catches the first breath of light. The last night of the tribe begins not with thunder or fire, but with silence so complete that even time seems afraid to move. When archaeologists first uncovered the valley, they expected the usual signs of time. Layers of soil showing generations of rebuilding, hearths stacked one over another, pottery shards from families who lived and died in the same place for centuries. But this valley was different. The story in the ground stopped suddenly, as if someone had torn out the last pages of a book. Beneath the surface, there were homes, tools, bones, and fire pits. Everything a thriving community needed to survive. But above that layer, nothing. No rebuilt huts, no later graves, no trace of human return. It was as if the entire tribe had vanished overnight, and the earth had quietly sealed the evidence. The scientists called it an occupation gap, but that phrase felt too cold for what they were seeing. They could sense something heavier in the soil, a stillness that felt like grief. The hearths were filled with ash, but the ash was pure and undisturbed. No one had come to light those fires again. No wind had blown new seeds into the floor of the huts. Even the tools were left behind, as if people planned to return and never did. Archaeology often feels like eavesdropping on ghosts, but this site felt different. It felt like a silence that refused to fade. The valley itself was beautiful, a ribbon of green between two sandstone cliffs. A river wound through it, shallow but steady, rich with fish. To the untrained eye, it looked like the perfect place to live. To the trained one, it looked like a promise broken. Around the edges of the camp, the soil was darker where crops had once grown. The bones of animals lay buried in neat piles, showing that these people had lived with rhythm and order. Nothing about their life suggested collapse. There were no signs of starvation, no sudden disease, no great fire sweeping through. It was not nature that ended them. It was something else. The scientists dug carefully, layer by layer, brushing away centuries of dust, hoping for signs of what had happened. But all they found were still bodies, tools, frozen mid-use, and the haunting evidence that no one ever came back. The absence became its own kind of discovery. In a way, this empty valley told a story louder than ruins ever could. It whispered about loss so complete that even memory had fled. And yet, in the quiet, there was beauty. The stone hearths still stood in perfect circles, blackened by fires that once warmed a family. The clay walls still bore faint fingerprints, ridges left by hands long turned to dust. Every mark was a reminder that people had once lived, loved, and believed their world would continue. But it didn't. The valley had no descendants. No one carried their songs or their stories. What was left was only the echo of a community that ended without a farewell. The wind moved through the ruins now, brushing past the empty hearths, carrying a kind of peace mixed with sorrow. It was a valley that had once held life, laughter, and warmth. Now it held silence, perfectly preserved. When the excavation reached the level of the bones, the story began to speak for itself. The first skeletons lay where the floor of a hut once was, curled in the fetal position, as if still dreaming. The posture was gentle, peaceful even, until you noticed the fractures. Clean strikes to the skull, sharp enough to end life instantly, silent enough not to wake the others. More bodies appeared, some lying on their sides, others face down by the doorways, all caught in the same frozen moment. The archaeologists expected chaos, signs of struggle, bones scattered from panic or flight. Instead, they found order. People had died where they slept. No broken arms raised in defense. No blade marks across forearms. These were not warriors caught in battle. They were families who never had a chance to open their eyes. The floor was covered with fine layers of ash and soil that had settled slowly over time, sealing the remains in perfect detail. Even after thousands of years, the bones told a story of stillness and surprise. One researcher described it like finding an orchestra that had stopped mid-note. There was something haunting in the symmetry, in the quiet way the dead seemed to rest. A child's skeleton was found beside an adult, their hands almost touching. Another pair was discovered near the central hearth, bodies close enough that the final breath of one might have brushed the other. The team could see how life had been before the attack, how each person had a place, a pattern, a nightly ritual, and then, in an instant, it was gone. The lack of defensive wounds said more than any artifact could. It told them the tribe had been ambushed while asleep, their killers striking fast and clean. The blows were deliberate, aimed for the head, meant to end life before sound could spread. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. They had practiced. As the team mapped the positions, a chilling pattern emerged. Those nearest the entrances died first. Those farther in followed seconds later. The attackers had moved through the camp like a storm, each strike timed, precise, efficient. One by one, the sleepers fell without waking. The scientists moved carefully, documenting every angle, every fracture, every clue. But they could not escape the feeling that they were standing in the middle of a story that had ended too soon. Every bone seemed to whisper the same word. Surprise. The kind that comes too late to scream, too sudden to run. The valley above was bright and quiet, birds calling over the cliffs. But beneath the soil, the night of the ambush replayed in perfect silence. The bones did not lie. They remembered what happened, even when history forgot. Each fracture was a sentence. Each position was a paragraph. Together, they formed a story written not in ink or stone, but in the fragile architecture of human remains. It was a story that began with trust and ended before dawn. Morning never came for them. The camp was caught forever between one night and the next day that never started. When the archaeologists brushed away the layers of earth, they uncovered a scene that looked less like a ruin and more like a moment paused in time. A clay pot still sat over the ashes of an old fire, cracked but not shattered. Inside it were the remains of grains, half, ground, and waiting to be cooked. Someone had been preparing a meal when the night fell. A flint knife lay beside a grinding stone, its edge sharp enough to cut a reed. A bone needle was still threaded, the sinew unbroken. These were not relics of people who abandoned their home. These were traces of people who had every reason to believe they would wake up. Nothing in the camp showed panic. The huts were intact, tools neatly placed, storage pits full. It was as if time had simply stopped. The researchers used carbon dating on the burnt wood and determined the fires had gone out between midnight and dawn. That narrow window, when the air is coldest and the world feels still, was when everything ended. The timing told them more than any artifact could. The attack was planned for precision. The killers knew the rhythm of the camp, the way families slept through the deepest part of the night, the moment when even the fires surrendered to darkness. They came when the stars were fading, but before the sun could rise. And then they disappeared, leaving behind a world mid-sentence. Every detail in the site spoke of interrupted lives. A woven basket with berries still inside, a child's toy carved from wood lying beside a sleeping mat. The grains near the fire were scorched just enough to show they had been heating before being abandoned. This was not a settlement destroyed by storm or hunger. It was one stolen in silence. The archaeologists walked among the remnants carefully, aware that each footprint they made disturbed the last steps of the tribe. It was easy to imagine the sound that morning should have brought. The crackle of rekindled fire, the chatter of children, the smell of cooked roots. Instead, there was nothing. The valley had turned into a snapshot of a day that never finished. Scientists called it a frozen moment, but even they admitted the term felt too clean. What they found was haunting. It was like someone pressed pause on a living world and never pressed play again. The tools, the pots, the grains, all spoke of a promise broken by something brutal and unseen. The day had been ready to begin. But before light touched the valley, before the smoke rose from the hearths, before the first word could be spoken, an entire community was erased. And all that remained was the ghost of an unfinished day, preserved perfectly in clay, ash, and silence. The camp had been built with care. Every hut faced inward toward a shared fire pit that glowed at night like a small sun. Around that center were rings of safety. The elders slept closest to the warmth, the children even closer, cradled in woven baskets lined with animal fur. Beyond them, the hunters and guards slept near the entrances, keeping watch over the outer circle where food and tools were stored. It was a pattern designed by generations of survival, a layout meant to keep danger out. But that night, it failed. When archaeologists mapped the remains, the geometry of the camp revealed more than blueprints ever could. They could see how the people had organized their lives, how protection had been a daily ritual. Each circle represented trust, cooperation, and a shared sense of duty. The problem was, the attackers understood it too. Whoever came through that valley knew the plan. They knew the order of the huts and where the guards would rest between watches. They entered not from the obvious path where tracks could betray them, but from the low side of the valley, hidden by reeds and shadow. They breached the camp through the weakest point, slipping between storage pits that doubled as the natural boundary. The evidence of their path was faint, but unmistakable. A few disturbed footprints, a dropped weapon tip, a line of compacted soil where feet had passed in single file. The first hut they reached was one of the outer rings, where younger hunters slept. The bones found there were fractured, quick and clean. The guards had no time to shout. From there, the killers moved inward, using the very design of the camp against its people. The same circular pattern that once protected the tribe now funneled the attackers straight toward the heart of the community. By the time they reached the inner circle, the night was already lost. The archaeologists reconstructed the map using soil chemistry and ash traces. They found where fires once burned brightest, where food was stored, and where children had slept. Every line told a story of order turned against itself. It was clear these people believed their system made them safe. The outer huts were built slightly thicker, the entrances angled to catch the morning light and confuse any intruder approaching in darkness. But against those who already knew the pattern, it meant nothing. The invaders had studied them long enough to find every gap. The tragedy of the circle was that it gave the illusion of safety. From above, the camp would have looked perfect, a symbol of unity and balance. Yet perfection leaves no room for mistakes, and that is where vulnerability hides. When the archaeologists looked at the layout, they realized they were staring at a map of both trust and betrayal. The tribe's defense had been beautiful in design and fatal in execution. The circles that once protected them became the very paths that led their killers to the sleeping heart of the camp. The tools of death were not random. They were chosen with care, shaped for one purpose, and carried by people who understood how to kill without being heard. When the archaeologists uncovered the weapons, they immediately noticed something strange. The stone points scattered among the bones were not made from local rock. The tribe had always used the same nearby quarry for their tools, a pale grey flint that was easy to spot in the soil. But the blades found in the valley were darker, almost black, made from volcanic glass that came from far away. That meant the attackers were outsiders. They had travelled miles, maybe days, to reach this camp, and they did not come unprepared. The spear tips were small and thin, designed not to break bone, but to pierce quietly. The shafts were charred black, not by accident, but on purpose, a method to hide reflections under moonlight. The clubs, heavy and balanced, showed impact fractures so consistent that scientists knew they were reused weapons, carried from raid to raid. Whoever held them had done this before. These were not desperate wanderers or starving hunters. They were specialists, trained in silence. The forensic team examined the marks on the bones and realized that every blow came from an angle that suggested control. The attackers struck fast, one hit per victim, moving with the rhythm of people who had rehearsed. The tools were extensions of instinct, weapons that demanded precision. No bronze, no iron, only stone, wood, and sinew, yet deadly in practiced hands. One spear fragment even had traces of soot mixed with animal fat, a trick used to keep the wood from creaking in the cold. The details painted a picture of a group that had studied their craft, not for defense, but for ambush. They knew the difference between sound and silence, between a scream and a breath. The archaeologists found footprints overlapping in clusters near the entrance of the camp. There were no signs of hesitation or confusion. The killers had moved in formation, some carrying spears, others clubs. A few likely carried fire, starting kits, though they would not use them until the end. This was not chaos, it was a plan. Even the tools left behind spoke of hierarchy. The best crafted blades were found closer to the first victims, suggesting the most skilled raiders led the attack. The cruder ones appeared deeper in the camp, wielded by those who followed. It was as if every member had a role. When the scientists cleaned and catalogued the weapons, they realized they were holding the earliest evidence of organized warfare. This was not random violence. It was strategy. The killer's toolkit was a message carved in stone saying, "We knew you, we studied you, and we made sure you would never wake again." In that valley, under a silent sky, the oldest weapons of murder had done their work perfectly. The ash told the story better than words ever could. When the archaeologists brushed away the soil, they found a thin layer of grey dust spread across the floor of the huts. It was fragile as paper, but underneath it were footprints, frozen like fossils. Some were small, light, careful. Others were deep and broad, pressed by heavy bodies moving with speed. The ash had fallen from the fires the night before, settling on the floor just hours before the attack. When the raiders entered, they left their signatures everywhere. Every step was a clue, a fragment of a forgotten dance. Using microscopic scans, scientists mapped the direction of each footprint, tracing the flow of movement through the camp. It looked like a pattern of controlled chaos. Lines of entry through the doorways, sudden turns near the sleeping mats, sharp pivots where bodies fell. The story emerged like a trail of ink. The attackers had moved in pairs, each one taking a specific path. The smallest details confirmed it. In one hut, ash had been swirled into thin plumes near the entrance, proof of someone crouching low to avoid being seen. In another, a trail of tiny particles fanned outward from a central spot, the mark of a body hitting the ground. It was choreography written in dust. Forensic experts compared the spacing between steps, and realized the attackers moved faster than walking but slower than running. They were hunting in silence, coordinated enough to strike at the same moment across multiple huts. The camp became a map of motion, a snapshot of fear and precision. Trampled thresholds showed where they entered. The direction of ash plumes showed where people fell. Even the shape of some footprints told part of the story. The raiders went barefoot, their soles padded with animal hide or mud to muffle sound. The tribe inside never stood a chance. They were sleeping when the shadows entered, when the ash that had settled so peacefully just hours before turned into a trap for history. The archaeologists reconstructed the entire sequence like a crime scene. It was eerie to see it laid out, each footstep leading to a silent death. They used light projections to connect the paths, thin strings stretching from one doorway to another, from victim to killer, from one side of the camp to the next. The result looked almost artistic, a web of tragedy woven in ash and time. But beneath the beauty was horror. The more they mapped, the clearer it became that this was not random movement. It was a practiced assault, a coordinated ambush, executed by people who knew exactly where to step and where to strike. When the scientists finished, they stood back and looked at the pattern. It was elegant, terrifying, and precise. Every footstep told the same story. Death did not stumble into that camp. It walked in quietly, step by step, following a plan written long before the first shadow crossed the threshold. The first clue was a set of faint grooves on the bones of a forearm. They were thin, shallow, and evenly spaced, too regular to be from animal bites or decay. Under the microscope, they looked like the marks left by twisted fibers cutting into skin. The scientists realized what they were seeing. The victims had been tied. Around the wrists of several skeletons, the soil had a strange texture, darker and denser than the rest. Chemical tests confirmed it had once contained plant material, the kind of fiber used for weaving rope or nets. It had rotted away long ago, but its imprint remained like a ghost around the bones. These were not defensive wounds, they were restraints. Whoever attacked this tribe did not just kill, they controlled. Some of the bodies were found lying flat, arms pulled tight behind their backs. Others were discovered with wrists pressed together in front of the chest, as if they had been bound before being struck. The positions were unnatural for sleep, but perfect for capture. One adult skeleton still had shoulders twisted at an angle that only happens when someone struggles against a tie that will not break. It was clear that some of them had woken up before the final blow, unable to move, unable to run. The attackers had made sure of that. Twisted plant fibers were found near the edges of the huts, preserved where the fire had scorched the ground but not burned it completely. The fibers were made from reeds and bark strips, the same material used in traps and fishing nets. This wasn't random, it was prepared. The raiders had brought ropes with them, planning not only to kill, but to capture or immobilize. That level of intention sent chills through the research team. The evidence suggested some victims were kept alive, at least for a short while. The marks on their bones showed signs of pressure that lasted longer than a few minutes. Some were tied tightly enough that the circulation would have stopped. Others showed faint fractures on the wrists from twisting and pulling. The scientists could almost see it play out. The silence, the confusion, the desperate effort to break free. The ash beneath some of the bodies was smudged and disturbed, proof that they had moved even after being struck down. The tribe had been taken apart piece by piece, not in rage, but in cold order. The attackers had done this before. The plant fibers told the story of control, of domination disguised as efficiency. Even after thousands of years, the ground remembered the pressure of the ropes, the pull of the struggle, the final stillness that followed. The archaeologists stood around those faint impressions, and realized they were looking at the oldest evidence of cruelty planned with purpose. Not just murder, but restraint. Not chaos, but mastery. Those twisted strands, now turned to dust, once bound the hands of people who never understood why the night had turned against them. The smallest bones were found first. Tiny ribs curled like dried leaves, delicate skulls no bigger than a fist. They were clustered near a sleeping platform made of woven reeds and clay, the remains of a family huddled together in their final rest. The archaeologists went quiet when they saw it. You could almost picture the scene before it happened. A mother humming a lullaby, her voice soft and slow, the rhythm of the fire matching the rhythm of her song. Outside, the night was calm. The wind moved through the valley, carrying the scent of ash and grass. The children drifted to sleep, unaware that the sound of their mother's voice would be the last music they ever heard. The attackers came when the song had ended, when breathing had slowed, when even the insects had quieted. There were no signs of struggle near the platform. The small skeletons had not moved. They had not tried to run. It was mercy through ignorance, or perhaps cruelty perfected. The scientists studying the remains found something unusual. The children's bones were unbroken. The adults nearby bore the marks of strikes, but the little ones did not. This meant they died differently, maybe from suffocation or smoke when the fires were lit after the attack. Some were found curled together, one tiny arm draped over another. The scene was frozen in a kind of tragic peace. It was not chaos, it was silence. The mother's skeleton was found just a few feet away, one arm extended as if she had tried to reach them before the end. Her body faced the door, where the first blows must have come from. She had not fled, she had turned to protect. The archaeologists measured the layers of soot and found that the fires used to destroy the huts were lit only after every heartbeat inside had stopped. That timing was no accident. It was ritual. The raiders waited until the quiet was complete before covering the camp in flame. The lullaby of sleep had become the lullaby of death. Forensic experts said the positioning of the children showed they had died without fear. That detail haunted everyone who worked at the site. It meant the cruelty lay not in how they were killed, but in when. The attackers had chosen their moment with precision, knowing their victims would be deep in dreams, defenseless and unaware. The children never screamed, never woke, never knew the world had ended. Their final night was ordinary. The stars still shone, the fire still burned, and somewhere in the stillness, a song faded into memory. Thousands of years later, that song remains unhearable but not forgotten. It lingers in the soil, in the posture of tiny bones, in the space between a mother's outstretched hand and the children she could not save. The lullaby ended, but the silence it left behind has never stopped echoing. Every discovery in the valley led to the same haunting question. Why this tribe, and why that night? The bones told how they died, but not why they were chosen. Archaeologists began piecing together the puzzle using the fragments left behind. The soil near the camp held traces of salt, not enough to form deposits, but enough to attract animals from miles away. That meant the valley had been a feeding ground, a rare place where herds came to drink and rest. In a world before fences and borders, that kind of resource was worth fighting for. Water and salt were power, and power always invites envy. The evidence hinted at a dispute older than memory. A few 100 meters upstream, another site was found, smaller but similar. Its people had used the same tools, hunted the same animals, and shaped their pottery the same way. But some of the artifacts there came from stone unique to the murdered tribe's camp. It was as if the two groups had traded once, or maybe one had stolen from the other. Archaeologists began to suspect a chain of retaliation, the kind that grows quietly over time until it explodes. It could have started with something small, a hunting party crossing into the wrong territory, a store of food raided during famine, or the abduction of a woman from one group to another. In prehistory, these acts were not isolated, they were blood promises. Revenge did not fade, it waited. Forensic analysis of the weapons found in the valley supported this idea. Some of the blades matched the style of the neighbouring site, sharper and darker, the kind used by people from the river's far side. The attackers had likely come from there, guided by anger and memory. To them, this was justice. To the victims, it was annihilation. Scientists studied the layers of soil and found evidence of drought around the same time. Pollen samples showed dry years, plants that struggled to grow, and water sources that shrank to a trickle. In desperate times, peace becomes fragile. The tribe in the valley may have been living well compared to their neighbours, their fires burning bright while others went hungry. That kind of survival looks like wealth to those who are starving. Some believe the motive was simple greed. Others think it was revenge wrapped in ritual. The precision of the attack, the silence, the complete destruction, all suggest it was meant as a message. Not just to kill, but to erase. In ancient societies, that was the ultimate punishment, to make sure your enemies left no trace, no descendants, no story to be told. Thousands of years later, the only thing left to speak for them is the ground itself. It remembers what the living forgot. Why this tribe and why that night may never have one answer, but the soil tells us this. It was not random, it was chosen. Their end was planned, calculated, and carried out under a sky that had watched 100,000 other nights just like it. Only this one would never end. The first hint of what pushed them to the edge came not from bones but from dust. Deep below the valley floor, scientists drilled cores of packed soil, each layer a time capsule of ancient seasons. What they found was a story of hunger written in pollen and ash. Grains of grass pollen, once abundant, thinned out sharply across the layers. The trees that once shaded the valley disappeared from the record entirely. Their absence meant more than deforestation. It meant drought. For decades, maybe centuries, the rains had failed. The rivers shrank, the animals moved away, and the plants that fed them all began to die. Isotopic tests on the soil confirmed it. The carbon and oxygen ratios were those of dry years, the kind that make survival a full-time job. The world of these people was narrowing, one meal at a time. The plants that did grow were tougher, smaller, full of silica that wore down teeth faster. Bones from the tribe showed heavy enamel wear, proof that every bite had become labour. Hunger changes people. It turns neighbours into competitors, and competition, in a world without laws, easily becomes war. Archaeologists studying this period began to notice a pattern. Across the region, sites that had once traded with each other suddenly showed signs of isolation. Pottery styles stopped blending. Trade goods vanished. Each community began hoarding what little it had. Cooperation gave way to calculation. One group's survival meant another's death. The valley, with its shrinking river and mineral, rich soil, became a prize worth killing for. The tribe that lived there had something others wanted. Maybe water that lasted longer in dry months. Maybe herds that still came to graze. Maybe nothing more than hope. In times of plenty, people share. In times of famine, they count. Every portion of food becomes an equation, every outsider a variable that threatens to unbalance the whole. The researchers called this mathematical survival, a cold arithmetic where you decide who eats and who starves. Somewhere in that desperate logic, someone decided that this tribe did not belong in the equation anymore. What makes this theory haunting is how familiar it feels. Even now, scarcity pushes people to the same edge, though our tools are sharper and our wars quieter. In the valley's layers, the drought's fingerprints were everywhere, cracked clay where water once pooled, seeds of plants that only grow in heat and dust. The world around the tribe had been closing in, and their choices must have grown harder with each season. When the killers came, it was not sudden rage. It was reason sharpened by starvation. To them, this was not murder, but math. One group living meant another could not. The wind that carried the dust through the valley that night was dry, harsh, and heavy with the scent of dying grass. It whispered the same truth it always does when the world runs out of mercy. Scarcity is the oldest weapon of all. The night began like any other. The air was cool, the fire low, and the valley wrapped in the kind of silence that only comes when everyone feels safe. But somewhere beyond the dark ridge, a group of men was already moving. They had waited for this moment for days, maybe weeks, watching the camp until they knew every pattern, every guard, every sleeping place. The first target was the sentry. His bones were found far from the others, near the edge of the valley. The wound on his skull was clean, straight through the temple, the kind that happens before a person has time to shout. He never saw them coming. Once the guard was gone, the path into the camp lay open. The attackers moved like a tide, quiet and sure, their feet covered in mud to muffle sound. The door flaps of the outer huts were made of hide, stretched on wooden frames. Heavy enough to keep out the wind, but easy to lift from below. The raiders used sharp flakes of stone to slice through the bindings at the corners. Each cut was quick and practiced. Then, instead of entering right away, they pinned the flaps back down, using sharpened sticks driven into the ground. It trapped the families inside without waking them. The people inside stirred only slightly when the night air slipped through the seams, thinking it was just the wind. The attackers moved from hut to hut, repeating the same method. They left the central fire untouched, so its faint glow would hide their movement in the flicker of shadows. Every sound was calculated. They smothered the smaller fires first, pressing them with damp cloth and sand until the camp grew darker. The glow faded, and the silence grew heavier. The air smelled of ash and earth and fear that had not yet begun. Then came the signal, a soft hiss, maybe a bird call, or the flick of a stone against another, something too natural for anyone sleeping to notice. The raiders pulled up the first door flap and slipped inside. The rush was fast, silent, final. No shouts, no panic, only movement. Those who woke did not have time to scream. By the time the first hut was done, the second was already falling. The entire camp fell within minutes. The killers worked in pairs, one holding the entrance, the other striking. The rhythm was perfect, the sequence unbroken. By the time the first body hit the ground in the central circle, it was already too late for anyone else to run. The archaeologists pieced this together from the layout, from the ash patterns and blood traces left in the soil. It was not war, it was execution. The first cut of that night was not the strike that killed. It was the slice of a door flap, the sound that began the end, so small and precise that even the wind did not notice. The night of the ambush was remembered not through screams, but through absence. No horns sounded, no calls for help echoed against the cliffs. The only music that played in the valley was made of breath, soft steps, and the muffled rhythm of clubs striking bone. Archaeologists call it acoustic discipline, but that phrase feels too calm for what it was. This was silence used as a weapon. The attackers had mastered it. They moved like wind sliding over grass, each one trained to kill without sound. Even their tools were adapted for quiet. The spear shafts were wrapped in softened hide, so they would not creak when lifted. The clubs were carved from dense wood that made a dull thud instead of a crack. They even avoided shouting to signal each other. Instead, they used touch, a tap on the shoulder, a shift in position, a breath shared between killers. Every sound mattered because sound meant warning, and warning meant resistance. Inside the camp, the tribe slept unaware that a chorus was forming outside their walls. It began with the faint crunch of dirt under feet, then the low rasp of fabric brushing against skin, a club lifted. A slow inhale, then impact. One sound replaced another until the valley itself began to hum with vibration too soft to echo. The killers worked in rhythm, not as individuals but as parts of one organism. Each hit, each step, each movement fed the next. It was precision born from practice, the kind that comes only from many raids before this one. The archaeologists recreated the likely acoustics of that night using simulations. They discovered that the camp's position in the valley made it an amplifier for noise, but only at sunrise. At night, when the air was dense and cold, sound died quickly. That meant the attackers could move through the entire settlement without alerting huts just a few steps away. Nature itself conspired with them. The people inside never heard their neighbours die. Even the dogs, usually quick to sense danger, were found dead near their posts, struck first to ensure silence. The silence became the trap. By the time the first faint cry broke out, it was swallowed by the rush of air and the dull percussion of more blows landing. The archaeologists studying the site said the scene must have been unbearable. The victims had no idea what was happening. One by one, they disappeared into that soundless rhythm until there was nothing left but breathing. Then even that stopped. The valley grew still again, the only sound the faint crackle of embers collapsing in the hearths. In the end, it was not weapons or numbers that won that night. It was quiet. A silence so complete that it erased the line between life and death. A silence that conquered not by fear, but by perfection. When the killing was done, the raiders brought fire. They moved through the camp with torches pulled from the central hearth, pressing them into walls and bedding, letting the flames spread where they pleased. But this was not rage. It was ritual. The burn patterns on the clay floors and walls told the truth. The fire had come after the bodies fell. There were no signs of smoke in the lungs, no burns on living tissue. Everyone was already gone before the first flame touched the ground. Archaeologists studying the site found that the burning was deliberate, controlled. It did not aim to destroy everything, only enough to erase what had been. The huts were lit from the corners inward, so that roofs collapsed into themselves and buried what lay beneath. The raiders understood that fire consumes names. It leaves behind no stories, no symbols, no memory of who the dead once were. But what they did not understand was that fire also preserves. The heat baked the clay floors into stone, sealing footprints, tools, and even ash in a layer of hardened earth. The same flames that were meant to erase the tribe became the reason their story survived. In the charred remains, scientists found patterns that told how it happened. The outer huts burned first, catching dry grasses and spreading inward. The central hearth ignited last, fanned by the updraft of collapsing roofs. The fire reached temperatures high enough to turn bone brittle, but not enough to reduce it to ash. It left behind a strange kind of fossilized silence. Even the air that night must have felt alive, thick with smoke and heat. The smell of burning hair and thatch would have clung to everything. Sparks climbed into the sky, drifting over the valley like ghosts rising toward the stars. When dawn came, the raiders were gone, leaving behind nothing but smouldering ruin. They had done what they came for. The valley was dead, the tribe erased, The ground blackened. They believed they had wiped out the evidence of their crime, but centuries later, the blackened soil would tell a different story. The carbon residue left behind hardened around every object, preserving even the smallest details. The fire froze time. It kept the shape of woven baskets, the lines of footprints, the outlines of bones pressed into the floor. What was meant to destroy instead became a monument to memory. The archaeologists could read it like a map, every scorched line a sentence, every layer of soot a word. The raiders had wanted the fire to claim victory, to say this place was theirs now. Instead, it spoke for the dead. The flames that licked the walls did not erase them. They recorded them. The valley may have turned to ash, but within that ash was truth, sealed and waiting, so that thousands of years later, the fire that ended them would become the same fire that made sure they were never forgotten. Not everyone died in their sleep. When the archaeologists followed the trail leading away from the camp, they found 3 bodies lying halfway up the slope that led to a ravine. The soil there was loose and grey, mixed with splinters of shale that cracked underfoot. It was clear from their positions that they had been running. 2 adults and 1 adolescent, frozen mid-flight. The first lay face down, arms stretched forward as if still reaching for safety. The second had collapsed just a few paces ahead, turned on her side with an arrow lodged cleanly between her ribs. The third was farther up, smaller, a young one, struck from behind as the slope crumbled beneath their feet. Archaeologists could see it in the angles, in the way the shale shifted under their bones. This was panic made permanent. The arrows that killed them were different from the weapons found inside the camp. These were hunting arrows, lighter, meant for precision rather than strength. The attackers had used them for silence and control. The marks showed entry from the back, through soft tissue, straight into the lungs. Death would have come quickly, but not instantly. The victims would have had enough time to feel the air leave their bodies, enough time to realize that there would be no escape. The slope itself carried evidence of their struggle. Shallow grooves where feet had slipped, scattered stones showing sudden turns. Even the way the soil was displaced told of speed and fear. The researchers used drones to map every inch, tracing each movement backward toward the camp. They discovered that the trio had broken from the center of the settlement, possibly the only ones who woke early enough to try to run. Their path followed the riverbed, the one way out that wasn't surrounded by cliffs. But the raiders had known that too. Footprints in the sediment showed they were pursued. The killers had split off from the main group, moving fast, cutting them off before they could reach the narrow pass that led to safety. The arrows were fired from an uphill angle, precise and practiced. 1 shot for each, no misses. It wasn't revenge, it was containment. The raiders couldn't risk anyone surviving to tell what had happened. The archaeologists found blood traces in the shale that had turned dark and metallic over thousands of years. When it rained, those stains glistened, as if the ground itself remembered. The wind that swept across the ravine made a sound like whispers in motion, a faint echo of that desperate run. Standing there, you could almost see it. The rush of footsteps, the snap of twigs, the breathless silence after the arrows hit. The ones who ran were not cowards, they were witnesses. Their last steps carried the truth of what happened that night, out of the circle of firelight and into the open world. They did not make it far, but in a way, they still escaped. Their story survived, carved into the slope of the ravine, where the earth keeps running long after they stopped. The dead of the valley were never buried. When archaeologists uncovered the site, they searched for the usual signs of respect, the careful arrangement of stones, the shallow pits that once held the remains of loved ones. or the small offerings left behind to honor the departed. But there was nothing. No cairns, no markers, no signs of later visits. The bodies had been left exactly where they fell. Time did not forget them, it erased them. Wind and rain worked together to carry their names away, grain by grain. In most ancient communities, the dead were remembered. Even in the simplest societies, people buried their kin with some kind of ritual, a token, a piece of food, a tool placed near the hand, a gesture that said this person mattered. But here, silence stretched even into death. The absence of burials meant something more than destruction. It meant erasure by design. Whoever killed them did not want their memory to survive. The archaeologists called it cultural cleansing, but that phrase feels too modern, too tidy. This was an older kind of forgetting, one that reached deeper. The tribe's memory system, their songs, symbols, and stories, depended on continuity. Each generation carried the names of those before them, passing them through stories told around the fire. It was their history, their map of identity. To destroy that meant to destroy everything that made them a people. When the raiders left, they didn't just leave behind ash and bones. They left behind silence so complete it swallowed memory itself. No descendants came back to honor the dead. No one sang their names again. The line ended in that valley. The archaeologists noted that even centuries later, nearby tribes never resettled the area. The soil remained rich, the river still flowed, but no one built there again. It was as if the valley carried a curse, or maybe just a memory too heavy for anyone to touch. Over time, grass grew where huts once stood. The fires that had burned families to ash gave way to flowers and reeds. The land healed, but not the memory. When researchers looked deeper into the layers, they found traces of pigment in the soil, remnants of paint once used for body markings or rituals. It was the last echo of their culture. Each shade was unique, mixed from minerals only found in that region. No other group used that exact color again. It was their signature, and it vanished with them. The tragedy wasn't just the loss of life. It was the loss of identity, the deletion of everything that made them unique. No one remembered their language, their songs, their stories. Not even their enemies kept their names. They were removed from history so completely that only the earth itself remembered. The valley became their unmarked grave, a monument built not by human hands, but by the quiet persistence of time. Their names are gone, but their absence speaks louder than words ever could. The story of the tribe's end does not finish in their valley. It continues just over the ridge, where another settlement began to grow soon after the massacre. Archaeologists first noticed it by accident. The soil there was the same rich color, the same clay that had shaped the pots in the destroyed camp. But here the pottery was thicker, newer, and more abundant. Storage pits appeared larger, deeper, carved into the hillside with precision. This was not coincidence. The people who lived here were using the same materials, the same designs, and sometimes even the same tools as the tribe that had vanished. It was as if the victors had inherited the lives of the dead. Radiocarbon dating confirmed it. Within a few seasons of the valley's destruction, activity in the neighboring hills surged. Fires burned hotter, food stores multiplied, and grave goods became more elaborate. The victors' pantry swelled, fed by resources that once belonged to someone else. They had taken not just territory, but identity. The archaeologists pieced the clues together. The pots were made from clay, dug from the same riverbed that ran through the destroyed camp. The pigments for painting came from the same mineral veins in the cliffs. The new site, even showed traces of structures that mirrored the layout of the lost tribe's huts. It was imitation born from conquest. The killers had copied what they had erased. In ancient societies, taking your enemy's land was not enough. You had to take their symbols, their skills, their way of life. To erase someone completely, you had to make their memory serve your own survival. The victors rebuilt using the hands and traditions of the conquered. They filled their new storage pits with grain, meat, and salt gathered from the same valley that had once belonged to others. The bones of their dead were buried with more care, surrounded by beads and tools that bore designs first used by the victims. In one grave, scientists found a necklace carved from the same ivory used in the destroyed settlement. It had been refashioned, reshaped, but the material was unmistakable. The killers had turned trophies into heirlooms. It is easy to imagine the conversations that followed in that camp. Stories retold with the truth twisted just enough to make the victors heroes. Songs that celebrated their power, while the names of the dead were never spoken again. In time, their children would grow up believing the valley had always been theirs, that their ancestors had always lived in abundance. But the earth knew better. It kept the connection hidden beneath layers of ash and clay, waiting for someone to notice that one people's rise was built on another's fall. The archaeologists called it the echo effect. When one voice is silenced, another grows louder in the same space. The neighboring hills thrived, but their prosperity was haunted. Every grain stored in their pits, every tool shaped from familiar clay, whispered of the valley below and the people who had paid for that abundance with their lives. The most haunting discovery came not from what was found in the ground, but from what was missing in the blood. When scientists extracted fragments of DNA from the bones in the valley, they hoped to trace connections to modern populations. Every site like this usually leaves a fingerprint somewhere in the genetic record, a thread that ties ancient people to living descendants. But this time, the thread ended in silence. The samples were taken with care, from teeth, from long bones, from the dense inner ear where DNA often hides best. They were compared to databases containing genetic profiles from across the region. Thousands of sequences representing centuries of migrations and intermarriage. The result was absolute absence. Not a single haplotype matched. The tribe's DNA did not survive. It was as if the entire branch of their family tree had been cut off in one night and left to wither in the dark. Scientists tried again, repeating the process with newer methods, amplifying the fragments to recover even the smallest trace. They found contamination from soil microbes, trace bits of animal DNA, even faint signatures from the researchers themselves, but nothing human that connected to the living. The genetic trail went cold permanently. The tribe's genome was unique, isolated. It shared similarities with nearby groups, but was distinct enough to stand apart. That meant they had been separate for generations, developing their own traits, their own adaptations to the environment. And when they were killed, that entire genetic lineage vanished from the world forever. In simple terms, it was an extinction measured not in bodies, but in information. The scientists called it a genetic dead end, a phrase that sounds clinical but carries a quiet grief. Every human alive today carries DNA from survivors of ancient catastrophes, small bands that made it through droughts, famines, and wars. Our genomes are full of echoes from people who endured, but this tribe left no echo. They exist only as ancient code too damaged to read. Their mitochondrial sequences broke apart under time's pressure, their nuclear strands shredded into pieces, too short to reconstruct. The soil had erased them at the molecular level, One researcher described it as reading a book where every page is missing except for the stains left by the ink. You can tell it once held meaning, but the story is gone. The implications were staggering. Somewhere between their birth and that last night, an entire branch of humanity disappeared. Their voices, their faces, their bloodlines, gone. No one living carries their genes. No one shares their eye color or the curve of their hands. They were not ancestors. They were an ending. The valley held what remained of them like a sealed archive, untouched until the day modern science opened it and found only silence. The ledger of human history is written in blood, and in this case, the page was blank. They were a people who left no descendants, but whose absence remains inscribed in the DNA of everyone else. A void that quietly reminds us how easily entire worlds can vanish. The marks on the skulls were not random. Each fracture, each indentation, followed a pattern. When the forensic team mapped the injuries across dozens of skeletons, they noticed something chilling. The blows were identical in placement and angle, the same motion repeated again and again. The raiders who attacked the camp had not killed in panic. They had killed with training. The evidence was written in the bone. Most of the impacts were to the back of the head, just above the neck, where one strike can collapse the spine and end life instantly. Others were to the temple, clean and deliberate, a technique that minimizes noise and struggle. There were no wild swings or defensive wounds on the victims, no sign of chaotic fighting. This was violence rehearsed. The attackers knew exactly how to kill quickly, quietly, and efficiently. Archaeologists began to suspect something larger than a simple raid. The distribution of wounds across the site showed coordination. Some victims were taken down from behind, while others were restrained. The angle of each blow suggested attackers of similar height, trained in the same methods. That meant they belonged to a structured group, one that practiced killing as a skill passed down through generations. Violence here was not madness. It was curriculum. Even the weapons carried the same story. The stone clubs found buried near the site showed wear patterns in identical places. Each had been gripped the same way, swung with the same motion. Some still bore traces of blood residue sealed by ash, confirming they had been used that night. When researchers reconstructed the strikes using replicas, they found the motion almost elegant, a practiced rhythm that required control and strength. These were not starving scavengers driven by desperation. They were trained raiders, possibly warriors from a society where violence was not just survival but education. In prehistoric times, warfare was rare but deliberate. Groups that mastered it could dominate others without risking open battle. The same methods seen here appeared in later human conflicts: ambush, precision, silence, total erasure. It was a formula first tested in this valley. The bones told the story of its success. For the victims, it must have felt incomprehensible. One moment of peace, then a swift, surgical storm. The attackers struck like a coordinated machine, each member performing a role. The archaeologists compared the timing to military tactics thousands of years later and found eerie similarities. The spacing between the blows suggested teamwork. One attacker striking while another moved ahead, one guarding while another finished. Even in death, the victims revealed the sophistication of those who killed them. It forced the scientists to confront a disturbing truth. The birth of organized violence might not have begun with kingdoms or armies. It might have begun here, in this small forgotten valley, where someone realized that power could be taught. The skulls became textbooks. The attackers became students. And what they learned that night would echo across all of human history, a lesson in how silence, precision, and order can turn killing into craft. Long before written law or kings or courts, there were rules that lived in memory and blood. Justice in prehistory did not wear robes or carry symbols. It moved through stories, through obligation, through the weight of what one tribe owed another. Archaeologists studying the valley began to suspect the massacre was not senseless, but bound to these unwritten rules. The bones, the burned huts, and the silence all fit the pattern of what anthropologists call retaliation cycles. In a world without borders, power was balance. If one group stole food or took captives, the other group had to answer or risk appearing weak. Strength was reputation, and reputation was survival. You could not let an insult stand because insults spread faster than fear. The attack on the valley may have been that answer, a form of law before laws. The violence followed rules of its own. It was total, leaving no one alive to seek revenge, no one to tell the story from the other side. To those who carried it out, it might have felt like justice finally completed. Scientists found hints that earlier contact between the two tribes had been tense. Fragments of pottery from the destroyed camp showed decorations from another region, suggesting trade or tribute. Some think these items were peace offerings, perhaps payment after a previous raid or hostage exchange. If that negotiation failed, the result would have been inevitable. In early human society, hostages were often used to guarantee peace. A single broken promise, a single runaway, could reignite an entire conflict. Revenge was not chaos, it was arithmetic. You take one of ours, we take two of yours. You burn our granaries, we destroy your homes. It was deterrence disguised as justice. The raiders who struck the valley were not monsters by their own measure. They were following what they believed to be order. The absence of burials and the precision of the attack showed they wanted to end the cycle completely. No survivors meant no one to retaliate. The idea of total destruction was not born from cruelty, but from calculation. That is how early law worked, not by mercy, but by math. When archaeologists compared this pattern with later societies, the continuity was startling. The same instincts shaped the codes of Hammurabi and the early tribal councils of Europe. An eye for an eye was not invention, it was inheritance. The people of the valley had no written language, no symbols carved in stone, but they understood consequences. To exist among others was to be part of a fragile network of fear and respect. The massacre may have been the final enforcement of that law. No negotiation, no warning, only a brutal demonstration of what happens when the balance breaks. Justice without courts is not fairness. It is memory sharpened into punishment. Somewhere among the ashes, that truth was written first in blood and later in silence. The oldest kind of law we still carry within us. After the massacre, something subtle but lasting began to spread across the region. Archaeologists could see it in the soil, in the footprints of new settlements built after the valley fell. The huts changed. The people who came later had never seen that night, yet they built as if they remembered it. The doorways grew narrower, low enough that a man would have to crouch to enter. The doorposts thickened, reinforced with stone and packed earth. Sleeping areas that had once been spaced apart for comfort were now clustered tightly together in circles. Fires that had burned in the center of huts were moved to the edges, away from entry points. It was architecture born from fear, design reshaped by memory. The survivors were not direct descendants of the murdered tribe. The DNA told us that much. But trauma moves in ways genes cannot measure. Stories carried it, caution carried it, even silence carried it. Generations later, people still built homes like fortresses, every doorway a defense, every wall a reminder of what could happen in the dark. The archaeologists began calling it cultural PTSD, a term borrowed from psychology but rewritten in clay and wood. You can see it in the layout of entire villages. Before the massacre, Settlements sprawled freely along rivers and plains. Afterward, they began to cluster on hillsides or behind ridges, where visibility was better and approach was harder. Paths curved instead of running straight, designed to confuse intruders. The shift was not gradual. It happened almost immediately after the event's estimated date. Something about that night travelled through rumour or observation. Other tribes must have heard what happened to the valley people, and the horror became instruction. Do not sleep near open doors. Do not leave fires burning bright. Do not trust the silence. The new huts were built with defensive patterns even in places where no threat existed. The people were adapting to fear that had outlived its cause. The archaeologists found evidence that the fires themselves were repositioned for safety. Instead of large hearths meant for gathering, smaller fires were placed near doorways to create smoke barriers and keep predators, or people, from seeing inside. The light of community had become the light of suspicion. The change was practical, but it was also emotional. Fear became tradition. Children grew up believing that safety meant closeness, that open space meant danger. Even the songs changed. Lullabies once sung near the central fire were now whispered quiet enough that no one outside the hut could hear. The massacre had rewritten the region's architecture, reshaped its rituals, and redefined what night meant. Every door, every wall, every circle of fire was an echo of that one night when security failed. The descendants of other tribes might not have known the details, but they remembered the feeling. They built it into their homes. They passed it down like a warning, written not on paper, but in the very bones of the earth. The night we inherited never truly ended. It just found new walls to live inside. When archaeologists first uncovered the valley, they treated it like a discovery. Photos were taken, reports were written, and diagrams filled with arrows and numbers tried to capture what had happened. But as the full story began to emerge, a question grew heavier with every finding. How do you tell the story of people who can no longer speak for themselves without turning their suffering into spectacle? It is easy to focus on the horror, the violence, the mystery of the night that ended them. That is what draws attention. But beneath the ash, they were not just victims. They were people who loved, who built, who sang their children to sleep. They had favourite foods, shared jokes, and argued over small things that would never make history books. Their story deserves more than shock. It deserves dignity. Scientists, historians, and storytellers faced a moral problem older than writing itself. Every time the past is revealed, someone decides which parts to show and which to keep hidden. Do you describe the wounds in detail, or do you let silence speak for them? Do you reconstruct faces so that people can see the lost tribe's humanity, or does that become another kind of intrusion? In museums and documentaries, tragedy often becomes performance. Bones become exhibits. The dead become lessons. But in the valley, the team made a choice. They decided not to display the remains. Instead, they focused on the lives before the night. They recreated how the tribe cooked, how they wove baskets, how they shaped their homes. They turned the camera around, away from the moment of death, and toward the long stretch of life that came before it. The goal was not to erase the violence, but to let the people exist beyond it. This approach changed how the site was studied. The ashes were not catalogued as evidence of murder, but as fragments of daily life interrupted. Charred grains were treated as meals unfinished. Tools left behind were not relics of loss, but proof of living. By seeing them this way, the archaeologists began to understand something deeper. The valley was not just where they died, it was where they lived for generations. The ordinary became sacred. Every artifact, no matter how small, carried weight. It reminded everyone that history is not just built on great events, but on the quiet repetition of human life. The ethical challenge remains for anyone who tells this story now, to speak for the silenced without speaking over them, to show what happened without turning pain into entertainment. The valley's tragedy belongs to all of us, but so does its memory of life before the fire. When we turn the camera around, we stop looking only at death. We start seeing the full circle of what it means to be human, fragile, enduring, and worth remembering. Amid the blackened soil and broken walls, there were small things that refused to vanish. The archaeologists found them scattered like whispers under layers of ash. A grinding stone worn smooth from years of use. A shell bead, tiny and perfect, buried near what had once been a child's sleeping mat, the lip of a clay pot, repaired carefully with resin and fibre long before the fire came. These were not grand discoveries. They were traces of persistence, proof that this tribe's story was more than its ending. Every artifact spoke of continuity, of hands that shaped and reshaped their world even when it cracked. The grinding stone was the most telling. Its surface carried thousands of tiny scratches, each one the mark of a meal prepared. A plant crushed into flour, a family fed. The scientists who studied it noticed that it had been used unevenly, worn deeper on one side. That meant it had belonged to one person, used in the same way day after day. A tool like that becomes an extension of the self. Whoever held it had likely passed it down, generation after generation, until the final owner used it one last time. Even after everything else was gone, the stone stayed where it had always been, grounded and enduring. The shell bead was different. It came from the coast, more than 200 miles away. That meant it had travelled through many hands, traded and treasured until it reached this child. It was a symbol of connection, proof that even isolated tribes lived in networks of exchange and friendship. The bead was found beside the remains of a small skeleton, likely a girl no older than 7. The hole drilled through the centre showed it had been worn as a necklace. In that one ornament lived the idea of beauty, of belonging, of a mother's care. It outlasted everything that tried to erase her. Then there was the pot. Most ancient pottery breaks, but this one had been broken before and mended. The repair was clumsy but deliberate, a line of hardened resin binding the lip back to the vessel. Someone had cared enough to fix it, instead of remaking it. That choice mattered. It meant patience, value, the will to keep what was loved even when it was flawed. When the archaeologists lifted it from the soil, they found faint traces of grain still inside. It had been filled for the next morning. These small things became the tribe's final voice. Not the weapons, not the bones, but the objects of daily life that quietly survived the unsurvivable. They spoke of people who worked, loved, decorated, and repaired. People who did what humans always do, create meaning out of routine. In the end, these artifacts are not just remnants, they are defiance. The world tried to erase them, but these fragments insist on remembering. They remind us that history is not just the story of what was destroyed, but of what refused to disappear. At dawn, the valley looks almost peaceful. The light moves slowly over the ridges, turning the ash to silver and the stones to gold. The wind carries nothing but the soft hiss of dust shifting across the ground. To someone standing there now, it would be hard to imagine that this quiet place once held laughter, firelight, and songs. But the earth remembers. Beneath that stillness lies a night when everything ended. When archaeologists first arrived, they stood at this same hour, watching the sunrise fall over the empty camp. It felt wrong that beauty could return to a place born of such terror. Yet it did. The world keeps moving even when memory tries to hold it still. The huts are gone. their shapes pressed faintly into hardened clay. The bones that once filled the ground are now sealed in laboratories, each fragment catalogued and labelled. The fires that consumed them have long since cooled. What remains is air, light, and silence. But silence has weight here. It presses against you like a held breath. It asks you to listen, not for the screams or the chaos, but for the lives that came before them. This is where the story began and where it must end, not in the violence, but in what it teaches. The massacre in the valley was not unique. It was one of countless moments in human history when survival turned against itself. But this one survived in the record, frozen between fire and clay, to remind us of something essential. Our continuity, the miracle of existence, was never guaranteed. For every lineage that thrived, another vanished. For every civilization that rose, another fell in silence. We are here because others were not. The sunlight creeps further down the slope, catching on the places where pots once cracked and children once played. The patterns of the old camp are still faintly visible from above, like the ghost of a settlement half remembered. From the air, it looks like a ring, symmetrical and deliberate, a mark of community. The symmetry is haunting. It feels too perfect, as if time itself preserved the memory of how life once fit together. The archaeologists often return to this spot at sunrise, not to study, but to stand still. They say it is impossible not to feel the presence of what was lost. Some speak quietly to the air, offering words of apology or gratitude, though no one answers. Maybe they are speaking to the dead, or maybe to the living, reminding themselves how fragile all of this really is. When the light finally reaches the center of the camp, the last shadows disappear. For a brief moment, the valley looks untouched, new, as though the story could start again. It never does, of course. But standing there, with the wind whispering through the reeds and the sun warming the ashes, you understand the truth written in the soil. We are all survivors of someone else's silence. And every sunrise is a continuation they never received.